Welcome back to the U.S. Navy History Podcast. I am Dale, the captain of this podcast, and I am joined by the XO of the podcast, Mr. Kristoff.
Hey, it's me. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, Captain Dale.
Oh, you're more than welcome. So, today, we're going to do what you've been wanting to do for a while.
I want to do it all, so it's kind of hard to pinpoint that. But, yes, I'm picking up what you're putting down.
What am I putting down?
You're putting down the Spanish-American War. Yeah.
So, shall we get underway?
Yeah.
All right. So, Mr. Spanish-American War guy, do you know what year this took place?
Want to say 1898.
Bingo, you win
Yeah.
a prize of being able to stay on the podcast.
Thank goodness. What's the runner-up prize? Because maybe I just want to have the take-home version of this podcast.
Oh, that's keel hauling.
Oh, then never mind. I'll just accept first prize.
You're okay. That's good. Now, obviously, this was between Spain and the U.S. Do you know what brought it on?
Oh, yes, I do. So it was the USS Maine was in dock at a harbor in...
Well, I'm not talking about the actual event.
Oh, okay.
Put simply, it was the result of American intervention in the Cuban War of Independence.
Okay, yes, that's true.
That's the cause of it.
Thanks for getting that high-level view out there so that the listener is aware.
And then after that, we zoom in. Yeah, we'll be getting to the Maine.
Okay.
Yeah.
There was a phrase, remember the Maine, and I do. I remember the Maine,
Good.
and I remember the Alamo. They told me to do it. It's done.
Good. It's right there in the gray matter.
That's right.
All right. So let's get into this. So there were some problems arising from the Peninsula War. The loss of most of the American colonies because of the Spanish-American Wars of Independence and the Carlist Wars. This affected a interpretation of Spain's remaining empire. Because this is the time when, the colonial assets started to go away.
Mm-hmm.
People who finally realized that maybe going into somebody else's home and taking it for yourself was not good.
I mean, maybe. I'm just mess with you. Continue.
Maybe. It sounds like you want a colonial asset.
I'd rather have a colonial asset than be a colonial asset. I mean, if there was a binary, but I would be benevolent. I mean,
So did all the guys that did take these.
But I would do it different. You see?
They all said
They
that.
did it wrong. That wasn't true colonialism. I'm just messing with you. All right.
So liberal Spanish elites like a guy named Antonio Conves del Calixto and a guy named Emilio Castelar, they came up with new concept of empire. Canovos made clear in an address in the University of Madrid in 1882 that the Spanish nation was based on shared cultural and linguistic elements on both sides of the Atlantic. And so that's what tied the territories together.
Okay.
He did not mention that the language and cultural aspects
Was
were
imposed?
forced upon
Right,
them.
yeah. I was going to say, we share a lot of culture with Australia and UK, but they kind of imposed the language.
Yeah. Spain was different from rival empires like Britain and France with its methods and purposes of colonization. And France had their purposes as, spreading civilization and Christianity.
Okay.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. So Spain's major objective and contribution was spreading Christianity and civilization.
I could see that. I mean, that is different. There was a greater motivation in the Catholic Church for proselytizing than, I guess, what would be the UK's Protestantism. Definitely.
Right. But sending, what do they call them?
Conquista?
Well, I mean, there's that, but no, sending missionaries out to do, the God's work of conversion and, not forcibly, but like we do now, but, it was forcible back then. But having that an excuse, but still going in and just taking everything, you may say there's a difference there, but there's not really a difference there.
I think it was a little bit of both because they were doing both.
No, they were doing both,
Yeah.
but they were still going in and conquering.
Exactly. They were trying to rationalize the taking part, I think. It's like, yeah, but we're doing this over here. Just look at this.
Yeah.
Classic misdirection.
So in 1820, the U.S. president, who was president then?
1820? I don't know. It's somewhere between Jefferson and Lincoln.
Saying it's somewhere between Washington and Biden.
I narrowed it down. I went from 3 to 16. Well, it wasn't Madison, maybe?
You got a letter?
Monroe?
Bingo.
Aha.
James Monroe. And, he started the Monroe Doctrine.
Ah, yes.
And it stated that the United States would not tolerate further efforts by European governments to colonize land or interfere with states in the Americas.
That's a bold proclamation.
We stated in the last one, We May Dominate the World by Sean A. Mirsky, covers this extensively. So I definitely recommend that if you want to know more about that. Now, when the Monroe Doctrine was put in place, Spain's colony in Cuba was exempted.
No kidding. I did not know that.
It was. Before the Civil War, Southern interests attempted to have the U.S. purchase Cuba to make it a new enslaved territory.
Oh. I guess they were looking at all that rum and tobacco and lots of wonderful plantation use.
Instead, the Civil War happened.
Funny story about Cuba. When the Major League, this is much later, Major League Baseball was going to expand to Havana, but then Fidel Castro came to power and kind of shut that whole thing down, and so instead, Houston got an expansion team.
So the U.S. also during this time became interested in the canal. Now, there was two places that they were thinking about doing it. Of course, we know Panama, because that's where it got built. You know where the other place was?
I want to say El Salvador?
No. Nicaragua.
Ah, okay. Makes sense.
This came up because they had need for naval protection. So Theodore Roosevelt was inspired by a guy named Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan, who was a influential theorist. And that is what caused him to rapidly build up the Navy in the 1890s.
I see.
When Roosevelt served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy.
He has a very interesting trajectory. Like, he's done quite a lot.
He was everywhere.
Yeah.
And, of course, Theodore Roosevelt was very much a supporter of a aggressive war with Spain.
Yeah, I think this is after the Civil War, you see a lot less isolationism. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, this is when America was like, all right, we don't want anybody else but us. So we have to at least expand our sphere of influence around the American continent.
You're just reminding me of the Banana Wars. And yeah, that was some pretty crappy influence.
Yeah. So while all this was happening, the Cuba Libre movement started, led by a Cuban named Jose Marti. He established himself in Florida, and he also had offices in New York to buy and smuggle weapons. He also mounted a large propaganda campaign to generate sympathy to put pressure on Spain.
Man, this guy is a go-getter.
So the first serious bid for Cuban independence was the 10 Years' War. This erupted in 1868 and was put down by the Cuban authorities a decade later because it was the 10-Year War. Now, neither the fighting or the reforms in the Pact of Zanjon that happened in February of 1878 really stopped their desire for independence. Jose Marti, he spent years in the States in exile, really just organizing to get the independence that he and his people so craved for. And he launched a 3-pronged invasion of the island in 1895. His plan called for one group from Santo Domingo, who was led by Maximo Gomez. He had a second group from Costa Rica, led by Antonio Macio Grajelas.
Probably.
And another from the U.S. that was thwarted by U.S. officials in Florida.
Oh.
And the plan was to land in different places in the island to provoke an uprising. Now, the call for revolution was successful, but the result was not what Marti had expected.
It never is.
He did not get the grand show of force he wanted. They had a quick victory, and then lost it. So they pretty much had to settle in to fight a guerrilla campaign.
Is this so? I know Western powers kind of, when they would go to war, they would not use guerrilla tactics. It was very formalized, very rank and file, and these specific strategies and whatnot. Guerrilla tactics, is this kind of the era that we first start seeing them from Western powers?
We first started seeing them in the American Civil War.
Okay.
Because the South, that was their main bread and butter.
Right. I guess they were outgunned and outmanned, so they had to do something.
Exactly.
I guess
everybody else was taking notice.
I see. I guess there was some of that with the Revolutionary War as well. Like the British would come in marching in line, and we were hiding behind trees. And I guess all that experience with fighting Native Americans gave us an edge in that regard as well. So
right. So guerrilla warfare type of combat started with us.
Oh, you're welcome, world, I guess.
I mean, it does make more sense than just lining up abreast and slugging it out.
Yeah, with firearms in particular.
I mean, up until this time, they were pretty much just hand cannons.
Yeah.
So the accuracy wasn't all that good anyway. But once you started getting rifled barrel accuracy, jumped.
Yes, that's true.
So the prime minister at the time was Antonio Conves del Castillo. He sent General Aricino Martinez Campos to quell the revolt.
Yeah, I was going to correct you, but you got it.
Well, thank
you.
I
have no idea.
Now, the general, he was not very excited about this assignment. And because of this, he, wasn't using the best methods. And this earned him criticism in the Spanish press. So because of this, he was replaced by General Valeriano Weyler. I'm sure I did not say that correctly, and I apologize, but he's dead, so it doesn't matter.
Well, I'm sure, yeah. He is dead.
So I can't offend him.
That's true. Can I be offended on his behalf?
No.
Okay, continue.
Now, this guy had experience in completely putting down rebellions in the Spanish overseas provinces. So he deprived the insurgency of weaponry, supplies, and assistance by ordering the residents of some Cuban districts to move to a re-concentration area near where his headquarters was. And this was effective in slowing the spread of rebellion. Now, in the U.S., this fueled the fire of anti-Spanish propaganda. In a speech, the new president, William McKinley, said that, quote, "This was not civilized warfare, but extermination."
Does civilized warfare exist?
It would depend on your definition of civilization.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I guess if you're contrasting it with extermination, I guess you could draw a differentiation. Your end goal is not extermination. It's some objective, I suppose.
Yeah. But, I mean, the whole brutality of warfare before this time, this is when it's starting to change, when attitudes with, not pillaging
Right.
and taking advantage of the civilian population's mindset started changing.
I could see that.
So the Spanish government regarded Cuba as a province of Spain rather than a colony. And it depended on it for prestige and trade, and as a training ground for the army. So the prime minister announced that the Spanish nation is disposed to sacrifice the last placenta of its treasure and the last drop of blood of the last Spaniard before consenting that anyone snatch from it even one piece of its territory. In other words, just saying, we're going to fight to the bitter end to keep Cuba.
Yeah. I mean, well, they've already lost quite a bit by this point. Like, Mexico is gone, and that was a resource, and they're just losing territory after territory to either independence or... Yeah, I get it. They would want to hold on to Cuba.
Yeah. Now, this guy was assassinated in 1897. So their political system is now unstable. So that's not going to help matters.
Usually doesn't, no.
No. So the eruption of the Cuban Revolt and the measures that Weyler had put in place, this whipped up the newspapers in New York City to start, putting them in a frenzy.
Oh, yeah.
Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst recognized the potential for great headlines and stories and was like, we're going to stir this stuff up so we can sell more papers.
Oh, yeah. This is the dawn of yellow journalism.
Yeah. Both papers covered Spain's actions and Weyler's tactics in a way that confirmed the popular disparaging attitude towards Spain and America. In the mind, school books, and scholarship of the mostly Protestant U.S. public, and the Catholic Spanish Empire was a backward, immoral union built on the backs of enslaved natives and funded with stolen gold.
That's interesting.
Even though the U.S. was built on the immoral union.
I was going to say,
on the backs of enslaved.
Plenty of Protestants. Oh, we imported a lot of slaves too. I mean.
Yes, that too. And of course it was funded with stolen gold.
Well, I know that there was a period, I don't know if it's this time frame or not, or maybe previous, that the Spanish Empire had outlawed slavery. But the Portuguese Empire, which was one of its competitors, was doubling down on it. And so there was a lot of conflict over who controlled what and what was allowed where, and a lot of blurred lines because people still wanted slaves.
Yeah. That's depressing.
Well, I appreciate that they tried to at least stop on their end. Hey, we're not doing slavery anymore.
Yeah.
Any step in that direction, I think, should be appreciated.
Yes, that it should have started a long time before that.
Yeah, right. But
It should have been stopped when it started.
yeah, I agree. When you know better, do better.
Yeah. So the U.S. had important economic interests that were being harmed by this conflict and the uncertainty of the Cuban future. Shipping firms relied heavily on trade with Cuba. So they were suffering huge losses.
So let me see if I understand that situation properly. Shipping firms relied on trade with Cuba, which, if you look at the status quo, was a province of Spain. And so what they wanted was no conflict, I would imagine. It's like, hey, just settle down. Let's keep making money together.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You're messing with the money.
Right.
Whenever you mess with the money, that takes off the countries.
Right. That's when people get off their butts.
And it's like, you're going to end this or we're going to end it for you. So, yeah, the shipping firms, they go to Congress and the president, and they're like, you guys need to end the revolt.
That's interesting because that is not traditionally what America did, especially up at this point. They did not, I mean, notwithstanding what we talked about in the last few episodes, like I said, there's kind of this growing interventionist mindset. But, hey, our money's being messed with. You need to go fix their problem.
The businesses that invested specifically in Cuban sugar, they went to the Spanish and said, you guys need to restore order.
That seems more appropriate in a way because that's Spain's deal. That's their problem.
So, they all wanted stability so they could keep making money. But how this stability would be achieved would largely depend on the Spanish and the Americans to work out their issues diplomatically. McKinley, for his part, wanted to end the revolt peacefully, and he actually threatened to consider recognizing Cuba's belligerent status. This would allow the legal rearming of Cuban insurgents by the U.S.
Oh.
He sent a guy named Stuart L. Woodford to Madrid to negotiate an end to this conflict. The negotiations did go smoothly, and Cuban autonomy was set to begin on January 1st of 1898. So that's going to bring us to the USS Maine. 11 days after the new Cuban government took power, a small riot erupted in Havana. This riot was thought to have been ignited by Spanish officers who were offended by newspaper criticism of General Weyler's policies. So McKinley sent the USS Maine to Havana to ensure the safety of American citizens and interests.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think
that's a good projection of power, and battleships are somewhat new at this point, right? I mean, the Civil War had ironclads, and so those were kind of the first steel-hulled ships, and we fast forward 30 years, and now we've got battleships.
Yeah, the Maine was the second battleship in the U.S. fleet.
Wow.
Actually. She was ordered in 1889, laid down in 88, and then launched in 90.
Okay. So it's seen some stuff. It's been, I guess, 8 years. It's been cruising the waters, and I'm sure not a lot of navies have battleships unless you're probably like in England, France, probably Spain, I would imagine, maybe.
Yeah. So the Maine gets there, and the Spanish government was notified just 18 hours before she got there. And this was contrary to diplomatic convention. You know, you're supposed to tell somebody well in advance when a warship is going to be coming to your
Right. Cruising right up
shores.
to your main city.
Yeah. So preparations for the possible conflict started in October of 1897, when McKinley arranged for the Maine to be deployed to Key West, Florida, as part of a large global deployment of U.S. naval power to attack simultaneously on several fronts if the war had not been avoided. So as she left Florida, a large part of the North Atlantic Squadron was moved to Key West and the Gulf of Mexico. Others were also moved just off the shore of Lisbon and Hong Kong.
Hong Kong? That's... Oh, I get it. Okay. At this time, the Philippines belonged to Spain. So... Anyway, that's interesting.
So at 2140, on February 15th, 1898, there was a massive explosion on the Maine, and she sank in Havana Harbor. Now, McKinley, he preached patience, but the news of the explosion and the deaths of 266 U.S. sailors, that stirred up the people.
Oh, yeah.
And they were demanding a swift response. McKinley, he goes to Congress and says, I need $50 million for defense. And, of course, Congress is like, yeah, here you go, buddy.
Wow, that's a lot of money in 1898.
Yeah.
Shoot, if you give that to me now, that's still a lot of money.
Oh, yeah. For any one person, that's a huge amount.
I'm gonna buy a battleship.
Now, most American leaders, they took the position that the cause of the explosion was not known. But the public, on the other hand, was like, it was Spain.
Right. Especially with Hearst and Pulitzer writing up headlines as they were, stirring the pot. Oh, yeah, I get it.
Spain was not able to find a diplomatic solution to avoid war. So it appealed to the European powers, all of them who told Spain they need to back down to avoid a war.
It's good advice.
So you do not want to mess with these guys. You need to just back down. So the U.S. Navy, they launched an investigation, of course. It was made public on March 28th and concluded that the ship's powder magazines were ignited when an external explosion was set off under the ship's hull. In other words,
sabotage.
Somebody swam out there, placed an explosive on the hull, and blew it up. Or a submarine went in, fired a torpedo, and blew it all to heck. And of course, this report just fired up the American public even more. Pretty much saying, yeah, war's going to happen no matter what.
I mean, yeah, that's an act of war. Right?
Yeah.
Attacking a warship
yeah.
like that?
Oh, yeah. Now, Spain, they launched an investigation of their own, which is not surprising. And they came to the opposite conclusion, that the explosion originated within the ship. And, of course, over the years, more and more investigations of what happened, were done. But, yeah, it didn't stop nothing.
Well, what were the conclusions of the later investigations? Because I've heard conflicting reports.
Don't think anything was ever official.
Okay. Because one of the theories I had heard is because battleships were so new, the placement of the powder magazine relative to, I think, some of the engine components, or I don't know the specifics, but there was something about it was a bad design, and this was kind of gonna happen at some point. It just happened to happen in Havana Harbor at night. So,
Well, there have been like 6 investigations.
okay.
The one from Spain in 1898 was the Del Pearl and de Salis inquiry. Their conclusions included: one, had a mine been the cause of the explosion, a column of water would have been observed, but it wasn't. The wind and the waters were calm on that date, and hence a mine could not have been detonated by contact,
Right.
but only by using electricity, and no cables had been found. No dead fish were found in the harbor, as would be expected following an explosion in the water. And munition stores do not usually explode when a ship is sunk by a mine.
True.
No, not really. That could be argued away by saying it depends on where
Yeah,
the mine hits.
that's a good point. Yeah.
The American Board of Inquiry, Sampson Board's Court of Inquiry, concluded that the mine had been blown up by a mine, which set off the explosion of her forward magazines. They based this fact on the majority of witnesses say that they heard two explosions and that the part of the keel was bent inwards. The official report stated at frame 18, the vertical keel is broken in two, and the flat keel is bent at an angle similar to the angle formed by the outside bottom plating. In the opinion of this court, this effect could have been produced only by the explosion of a mine situated under the bottom of the ship at about frame 18, and somewhat on the port side of the ship. Also, in the opinion of the court, the main was destroyed by the explosion of a submarine mine, which caused the partial explosion of two or more of her forward magazines. And the court has been unable to obtain evidence fixing the responsibility for the destruction of the main upon any person or persons. In other words, this is probably what happened, but we don't know who did it.
Makes sense. It could have been an agitator that wanted war.
In 1911, the Vreelands Board Court of Inquiry happened. They concluded that an external explosion had triggered the explosion of the magazine. However, this explosion was further aft and lower powered than concluded by the Sampson Board. They also found that the bending of frame 18 was caused by the explosion of the magazines, not by an external explosion. After this investigation, they refloated the intact portion of the hull and rescuttled her at sea in 1912.
I guess they raised the ship for the investigation, and then once they were done, they scuttled it again?
Well, in 1910, a cofferdam was built around the wreck, and water was pumped out, which exposed it. Why they refloated her afterwards and scuttled her somewhere else, I don't know. But they did at that time finish removing the guys who were killed, and they buried them in Arlington.
Oh, well, I like that. That's appropriate.
In 1974, Admiral Rickover did an investigation. He used information from the two official inquiries, newspapers and personal papers, and information on the construction and munition of the Maine. His investigation concluded that the explosion was not caused by a mine. Instead, spontaneous combustion of coal in the bunker next to the magazine was the most likely cause.
I see. Because everything was coal-driven at that point. At least modern warships.
In 2001, Wegner, who was an author, revisits Rickover's investigation and offers additional details. According to Wegner, Rickover inquired with naval historians at the Energy Research and Development Agency about the Maine after he read an article in the Washington Star-News, who claimed the U.S. Navy, quote, made little use of its technologically trained officers during its investigation of the tragedies.
I would think if you're going to investigate an almost 100-year-old event, you would try to get as many experts on the technology of the time or the history of that period to get a better idea of what's happening.
Yeah. So Rickover approached historians and got them excited about, what might happen. And so any and all documents that could be obtained were obtained and studied. And they came to the conclusion that since the photos showed no plausible evidence of penetration from the outside, they believed it originated inside the ship. Wagner suggests that a combination of naval ship design and a change in the type of coal used to fuel naval ships might have facilitated the explosion that Rickover's came up with. Up to the time of Maine's building, our common bulkhead separated coal bunkers from ammunition lockers, and American naval ships burned primarily smokeless coal. With the increase in the number of steel ships, the U.S. Navy switched to bituminous coal, which burned hotter and allowed ships to steam faster.
Oh, so originally the ship was designed for coal that was not as hot, but as the promulgation of more steel warships kind of came about, they switched fuel source. Efficient
They had
one.
to. Yeah. Now, the smokeless coal, the anthrite coal, was not subject to spontaneous combustion, but the bituminous coal was considerably more volatile. Matter of fact, it was known for releasing the largest amount of fire damp, which is a dangerous and it's explosive at a concentration between 4 and 16%, which the most explosiveness at around 10%.
Whoa.
There was a number of bunker fires being reported aboard U.S. warships before the Maine's explosion, in several cases nearly sinking the ships.
Wow.
The Wagner also cites a 1997 heat transfer study that concluded that a coal bunker fire could have taken place and ignited the ship's ammunition. So in 1998, National Geographic did their investigation.
No kidding.
Mm-hmm. It was commissioned by the Advanced Marine Enterprises. It was pretty much just done to commemorate the centennial of her sinking and was based on computer modeling. This is the first time that had been available.
Yeah.
The conclusions that were reached were inconclusive. The magazine reported that a fire in the coal bunker could have generated sufficient heat to touch off an explosion in the magazine. But on the other hand, computer analysis also shows that even a small handmade mine could have penetrated the ship's hull and set off explosions. They did note that the size and location of the soil depression beneath the Maine is more readily explained by a mine explosion than by a magazine explosion alone.
Important.
But this is not proof
Right.
that a mine was the cause of the sinking. It just strengthened the case.
I think it's important to elaborate on these different possibilities because it's such a pivotal event that led America in a specific direction. It's like, okay, well, what really did happen? And did that justify what happens next?
Now, the last investigation was in 2002 by the History Channel. Unsolved History.
Nice.
They utilized pictures, naval experts, and archival information to determine the cause of the explosion. The conclusion was that a coal bunker fire caused the explosion, and a weakness or gap was identified in the bulkhead separating the coal and powder bunkers, which allowed the fire to spread from the coal bunker to the powder bunker. Now, of course, we also have to talk about the false flag conspiracies. If we've already done this deep of a dive, we might as well talk about that.
Yeah, for sure.
There's been suggestions that it was a false flag operation conducted by the U.S. This is actually the official view in Cuba. Cuban officials argue that the U.S. probably deliberately sunk the ship to create a pretext for military action against Spain. The wording on the main monument in Havana describes Maine's sailors as, quote, victims sacrificed to the imperialistic greed in its fervor to seize control of Cuba.
I'm curious when that monument was erected. Was that post-communist Cuba, or was that in the window of time between this war, this impending war, and like 1956?
This was 1926. It went up in 26. Yes.
That's interesting. Because just the language, you know what I mean?
Yes. So, let's see. All right. So that is, all the theories on how she went down.
I'm glad we've established that.
So after the Maine was destroyed, newspaper publishers Hearst and Pulitzer decided that the Spanish were to blame. And they publicized this theory as fact in the New York papers. They also used astonishing accounts of atrocities committed by the Spanish in Cuba as well. And of course, they were exaggerating what was happening and how the Spanish were treating the Cuban prisoners. But the stories, of course, were based on truth, but were written in a way that caused emotional and heated responses from the readers.
I could see that. Just take a modicum of truth, exaggerate it, and then sell lots of papers.
Fortunately, though, this yellow journalism, as you had called it earlier, did not really go outside of New York City at this time.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so historians really don't cite it as a major force in shaping the national mood. Nonetheless, public opinion nationwide did demand immediate action. So, a speech delivered by a Republican senator named Redfield Proctor thoroughly analyzed the situation and concluded that war was the only answer. And of course, this incited more people to push for war. And this pretty much left McKinley and the Speaker of the House, Reed, pretty much the only opposers to the war.
Wow. I mean, those are important people to have as the opposition, but when someone stands up and says war is the only answer, I'm sure that's not taken lightly.
No. And especially if there's only two people in the entire country that's saying, we need to go kill them. There's not much you can do.
Right. I think, especially on the heels of the Monroe Doctrine, it's like America's getting a sense of itself, and kind of their view of interference by major powers in Europe. It's like, look, this is kind of going on too far. If we have the opportunity to do so, we need to step in, and then it's been building for some time.
Yeah. So, knowing that Congress would force a war, McKinley ends his resistance to it on April 11th and formally asked Congress for authority to send American troops to Cuba to end the Civil War there. And so on April 19th, Congress was considering joint resolutions supporting Cuban independence. And Republican Senator Henry M. Teller proposed the Teller Amendment. This was to ensure that the U.S. would not establish permanent control over Cuba after the war.
I think that's crucial.
Yeah. And it passed 42 to 35. They're evolving.
Yeah, it's still pretty close. It's like, why not? Hey, that's a rich country. We could totally do better.
Well, the House passed it the same day, 311 to 6.
Wow. See, that's the people's house right there.
The amendment resolution demanded Spanish withdrawal and authorized the president to use as much military force as he thought necessary to help Cuba gain independence from Spain.
Whoa. It's a blank check right there.
Signed it the next day, and Spain was then notified. Spain's result was to sever diplomatic negotiations and relations with the United States on the 21st.
I could see that. I mean, you get issued a declaration of war. It's like, all right, cool, we're not talking.
Well, it's not really a declaration of war. It's get out or we will take you out.
Oh, then I misunderstood.
It's a declaration of intent.
Oh, okay. Well, that's interesting that Congress would authorize so much to McKinley just for something that's not technically a war. You know what I mean?
Well, it's not a war yet. If the Spaniards refuse, then it would be war.
Oh. Okay. This is just such a unique situation in my mind. It's hard for me to... I see what you're saying. Like, do this or else, and they don't do it. Okay, so now we're at war.
So on that same day, the U.S. Navy began a blockade of Cuba. 2 days later, Spain declares war. And 2 days after that, Congress declared a state of war between the U.S. and Spain. Had existed since the 21st, which is the day the blockade began. Now, the Navy, they were ready, but the Army, not so much. They ended up quickly purchasing supplies so they can, do the war.
Gear up.
Yeah, in the spring of 1898, the strength of the U.S. Army was just 28,000 men. They were like, we need 50,000 more, which would bring them up to 78,000. The American people were like, no, you're getting 220,000.
Whoa.
Yeah, this was through people signing up and National Guard.
That's a lot of bold patriotism.
Yes. So, this is where we're going to end it.
Oh, you've ended on a cliffhanger. They're going to have to tune in next time.
So, at the end of our episodes, we like to honor one of our fallen angels with the help of HeroCars.us. And so today we're going to honor Lieutenant Vincent Robert Capodanno. His hometown was Staten Island, New York. And he was a chaplain in the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, 1st Marine Division. Navy chaplain. He received the Medal of Honor, the Bronze Star, and a Purple Heart. His date of sacrifice was September 4th, 1967, action in Quang Tri Province, Vietnam. He was 38. Affectionately known as the Grunt Padre because of his desire to blend in with the infantrymen under his care, Lieutenant Vincent Robert Capodanno was given constant reminders that it was not his job as a chaplain to go on patrols. But he preferred to wear no insignia of rank on his uniform and to go where the fighting was hottest and heaviest, telling a reporter, "I understand their trials better if I accept the same burdens they do." According to the Archdiocese for the Military Services, he became a constant companion to the Marines, living, eating, and sleeping in the same conditions the men. He established libraries, gathered and distributed gifts, and organized outreach programs for the local villagers. He spent hours reassuring the weary and disillusioned, counseling the grieving, hearing confessions, instructing converts, and distributing St. Christopher medals. Such work energized him, and he requested an extension to remain with the Marines. It was during his second tour on September 4th, 1967, when the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, that Father Vincent Capodanno made the ultimate sacrifice. Father Capodanno left the relative safety of his command post and ran through an open area under heavy enemy fire, administering last rites to the dying and giving medical aid to the wounded. Struck down by machine gun fire, he was awarded the Medal of Honor for his heroic conduct on the battlefield. His citation reads, "The President of the United States of America, in the name of Congress, takes pride in presenting the Medal of Honor posthumously to Lieutenant Chaplain Vincent Robert Capodanno, Naval Serial Number 0TAC 656197, United States Naval Reserve, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty as chaplain of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, 3rd Marine Division, Reinforced, Fleet Marine Forces, in connection with operations against enemy forces in Quang Tri Province, Republic of Vietnam, on 4 September 1967. In response to reports that the 2nd Platoon of M Company was in danger of being overrun by a massed enemy assaulting force, Lieutenant Capodanno left the relative safety of the company command post and ran through an open area raked with fire, directly to the beleaguered platoon. Disregarding the intense enemy small arms, automatic weapons, and mortar fire, he moved about the battlefield, administering last rites to the dying and giving medical aid to the wounded. When an exploded mortar round inflicted painful multiple wounds to his arms and legs and severed a portion of his right hand, he steadfastly refused all medical aid. Instead, he directed the corpsmen to help their wounded comrades and, with calm vigor, continued to move about the battlefield as he provided encouragement by voice and example to the valiant Marines. Upon encountering a wounded corpsman in the direct line of fire of an enemy machine gunner positioned approximately 15 yards away, Lieutenant Capodano rushed in a daring attempt to aid and assist the mortally wounded corpsman. At that instant, only inches from his goal, he was struck down by a burst of machine gun fire. By his heroic conduct on the battlefield and his inspiring example, Lieutenant Capodano upheld the finest traditions of the U.S. Naval Service. He gallantly gave his life in the cause of freedom. Among the many tributes memorializing Lieutenant Capodano, the Staten Island Marine Corps League erected a bronze statue of Capodano in 1977 in front of Father Capodano's chapel at Fort Wadsworth, New York. So, Lieutenant Vincent Robert Capodano, we thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so take us out.
All right. Well, listeners, thank you so much for your time and getting to know what our Navy has been involved with a little bit better. If you ever want to reach out to us, there's a couple of ways to do that. One, you can email us at usnavyhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can hit us up on Twitter/X, and that's at USNHistoryPod. You can find exactly what the handle is in the show notes. Go to the show notes, find out the handle, go to the right one, let us know. Also, while you're there, we have a Discord server you can join. We can exchange ideas, ask questions, and join the conversation. Lastly, if you'd like to rate and review us, you can do so on your favorite podcast platform or on YouTube. You can find our audio there as well. So please feel free to rate us, drop a comment if you can, and let us know what you think. One last thing, we do have a subscriber option. So if you would like to show us support financially, you are free to do so, and we will have interesting little tidbits for you as you go. So once again, thank you, and we look forward to delivering more content to you. Dale?
And always, we're going to wish you guys fair winds and following seas. Goodbye.
See